When I was about 18, I lived in a vibrant coastal town called Clearwater Shores. My neighborhood, nestled about 20 minutes from the ocean, was close enough to the beach that you could smell the salty breeze, but far enough to avoid the bustling crowds of tourists. My entire identity seemed to revolve around the beach. I'd been surfing since before I could speak, and sand was a constant companion, always in my shoes, my car, and somehow even in my bed. My two best friends, Rohan and Tyler, shared my love for the beach and were the type of guys who brought life to every situation. Rohan was extroverted and loud, always the first to strike up a conversation with strangers. Tyler, on the other hand, was more of a planner, always figuring out the how, while Rohan and I dreamed up the what together. We were inseparable. It was late May, just a few weeks before high school graduation, and the three of us were completely over school. College acceptance letters were in hand, and nothing felt more urgent than making the most of our fleeting time together before life inevitably pulled us in different directions. We spent our days surfing, hanging out, and dreaming about the endless possibilities ahead. One Saturday evening, Rohan and I made plans to meet up with two girls from school, Naomi and Leah. Naomi and I had been casually flirting for weeks, and Leah was one of those effortlessly fun people who made every moment feel like an adventure. Our plan for the night was simple: pick them up, drive to a secluded beach called Crescent Cove, and spend the night stargazing with blankets and wine. Looking back, I cringe at my recklessness, but at the time it felt like the perfect recipe for an unforgettable night. Around 9 p.m., I pulled up outside Naomi's house. She and Leah came out laughing, their playful energy lighting up the evening. They were clearly a little buzzed, giggling as they danced their way into the car. Rohan and I exchanged excited glances. The night was off to a good start. The drive to Crescent Cove took about 30 minutes, and the entire time, the four of us were caught up in the moment. The car was filled with laughter, teasing, and even a surprisingly deep discussion about the meaning of time that Leah and Rohan somehow wandered into. It felt like one of those perfect nights you know you'll remember forever. Crescent Cove was the ideal spot for what we had planned. Far from the crowded boardwalk and tourist traps, it was secluded and dark, perfect for stargazing. The path leading to the beach was a rugged dirt road, and from there, a narrow sandy trail descended steeply to the shoreline. I parked as far up the dirt road as my car could handle, and we unloaded our supplies: blankets, a couple of bottles of wine, and a flashlight. The night was everything we'd hoped for. The air was cool but not cold, the sky was impossibly clear, and the sound of the waves provided a soothing soundtrack. Hours passed as we talked, laughed, and enjoyed each other's company. Eventually, Rohan and Leah wandered off down the beach, leaving Naomi and me alone. We walked in the opposite direction, away from the faint glow of the flashlight they'd taken with them. After finding a quiet spot, I spread out a blanket, and we lay down, the stars above us like scattered diamonds. Naomi rested her head on my shoulder, and for a moment it felt like the world had paused, holding its breath just for us. That's when Naomi tensed. Her hand gripped my arm, and her body stiffened. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I strained to listen, but at first all I could hear was the rhythmic crashing of waves. Then, faintly, I caught it, a low, mechanical whirring, like the sound of a small engine. The noise seemed to move, darting from one direction to another, but I couldn't pinpoint its source. "It's probably nothing," I assured her, though I didn't fully believe it myself. But Naomi wasn't convinced. Her unease was palpable, and just as I was about to suggest we head back to the car, she let out a sharp gasp. "Look," she said, pointing upward. I followed her gaze, but at first I saw nothing. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw a drone hovering directly above us, illuminated faintly by the moonlight. My stomach dropped. It lingered for what felt like an eternity before suddenly zipping higher into the night sky and disappearing into the darkness. A cold dread settled over us. Someone had been watching us. The earlier noise now made sense, and the thought of being spied on made my skin crawl. Naomi's hand trembled as she wiped tears from her eyes. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. We hurried back to the car, where Rohan and Leah were already waiting. Their carefree expressions faded as I explained what had happened. The realization that we weren't alone on that beach hit all of us hard. The drive back to Naomi's house was tense. None of us spoke much, and when we did, it was in hushed tones. Neither Naomi nor Leah felt safe going home, and neither Rohan nor I wanted to leave them alone. That's when I thought of Tyler. His house was spacious, and his parents were the kind who didn't mind if friends stayed over late. Thankfully, Tyler was home and told us to come over. We piled into his driveway, still shaken. While Rohan and the girls went inside, I stayed in the car for a moment, needing time to collect myself. Leaning my head against the steering wheel, I took a few deep breaths. Then, I pulled out my phone. The screen lit up with a single notification. AirTag detected moving with you. My heart stopped. I stared at the message, unable to process it. Someone was tracking us. Panic took over as I jumped out of the car and began searching it. I checked under the seats, in the floor mats, and even the trunk. Nothing. Finally, I crouched down and felt around the tire wells. My fingers brushed against something smooth and cold. Taped securely to the underside of the driver's side tire well was a small AirTag. I ripped it off and stared at it, my hands trembling. Then, without thinking, I smashed it against the ground, breaking it into pieces. Grabbing one of the fragments as evidence, I ran inside to show the others. Their faces mirrored my own horror. Naomi and Leah both checked their phones and saw the same notification. Tyler was furious, realizing whoever had been watching us on the beach now knew his address. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and unease. We stayed in Tyler's basement, too scared to leave. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Tyler. His voice was panicked, almost frantic, as he told me to come over immediately. When I arrived, he was standing in the driveway holding a stack of photos. My stomach churned as I took them from his hands. They were grainy pictures of Naomi and me from that night on the beach. Someone had been watching us, documenting us, and now they were taunting us with the evidence. We called the police, but their investigation led nowhere. The experience left Naomi shaken, and she understandably pulled away from me. That summer, the beach I loved so much no longer felt like home. The waves that once brought me peace now seemed menacing, and the open sky felt less like freedom and more like exposure. Even now, I can still hear the faint whir of that drone in my nightmares, a haunting reminder of how easily innocence can be shattered. On a warm summer night, when my best friend Caleb and I were both 19, we decided to take a break from our usual wild adventures. At the risk of sounding pretentious, Caleb and I came from fairly well-off families in upstate New York. Summers for us meant lakefront views, lazy evenings, and carefree exploration around Lake Ontario. My family owned a lake house in Webster, while Caleb's was in Sodus Point, just under an hour's drive away. I preferred hanging out at Caleb's place, not just because his house was newer and more luxurious, but because the vibe in Sodus Point was more laid back. The area attracted people our age, college students, local teens, and seasonal workers all looking for a good time. Weekends, there were a whirlwind of bonfires on the beach, impromptu parties, and late-night bike rides under the stars. But that night, we opted for something quieter. No rowdy parties, no crowds, no drama. Just the two of us, a six-pack, a joint, and the tranquility of the lake. Caleb picked me up just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. The drive to Sodus Point was quiet, our usual banter replaced by the sound of the car tires on the empty road. When we arrived at his house, we quickly grabbed a couple of bikes from the garage, along with our drinks and a neatly rolled joint Caleb had prepared earlier. The air was warm and carried the faint scent of wildflowers and lake water. As we pedaled through the sleepy neighborhood, I noticed how quiet it was. Most houses were dark, their owners either asleep or away for the weekend. The streets were empty except for the occasional rustle of leaves or chirp of a cricket. It felt like we had the entire town to ourselves. Caleb had an idea to head further down the shoreline than we usually did. "Let's check out that beach at the end of Maplewood Drive," he suggested, his voice carrying over the hum of our bike tires. I wasn't familiar with the area, but I didn't mind. A longer bike ride sounded refreshing, and I trusted Caleb to know the way. Eventually, we reached the end of a secluded road lined with dark, silent houses. There were no streetlights, and the only illumination came from the faint glow of the moon. Caleb pulled his bike into a patch of tall bushes, and I followed suit, carefully hiding them from view. We crossed a narrow wooden boardwalk that cut through the dunes and emerged onto the beach. The sight before us was stunning. The sand stretched endlessly in both directions, a pale ribbon illuminated by the silvery moonlight. The lake was calm, its surface reflecting the stars above like a mirror. The air was cool, carrying the soothing sound of waves lapping gently against the shore. It was perfect. We plopped down on the sand, cracked open a couple of beers, and lit the joint. The first inhale was sharp and earthy, the kind of hit that immediately made you feel lighter, more at peace. We passed it back and forth, our laughter mixing with the gentle sound of the waves. Time seemed to slow down as we lay back in the sand, staring up at the vast expanse of stars. "Do you think there's anyone else out here?" Caleb asked after a while, his voice low and contemplative. "Doubt it," I replied. "It's just us and the universe tonight." The peacefulness of the moment was something I knew I'd remember for years. But it didn't last. It started as a faint sound, so subtle I thought I might have imagined it. A low, metallic buzzing, like the hum of a distant machine. I sat up slightly, straining to hear it better. Caleb must have noticed the change in my expression because he raised an eyebrow. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What?" he replied, sitting up too. Then his face changed. He heard it. The sound was peculiar. It wasn't mechanical, but it wasn't natural either. It was somewhere in between, an unsettling droning noise that seemed to vibrate in the air around us. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, and the longer it went on, the more uneasy I felt. We exchanged a glance, both of us silently agreeing to stay calm. After all, it was probably nothing. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on us, or there was a boat somewhere on the lake making the noise. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder. "What the hell is that?" Caleb muttered, his eyes darting around the beach. The noise seemed to be coming from the dunes behind us, but it was impossible to pinpoint the exact source. It felt like it was everywhere and nowhere at once. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and an icy feeling crept over me. "We should go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Caleb nodded, and we both stood up. The second we moved, the buzzing intensified. It went from a low drone to a loud hum that seemed to reverberate inside my chest. It was so sudden, so jarring that I froze. Caleb grabbed my arm and pointed toward the dunes. There, silhouetted against the starry sky, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its arms were unnaturally long, dangling almost to its knees. It stood perfectly still, like a shadow carved out of the night. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. "Run," Caleb whispered urgently. Breaking the spell, we bolted, running parallel to the shoreline, our feet sinking into the sand with every step. The buzzing sound followed us, growing louder and more oppressive. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The figure was no longer alone. There were more of them now, 3, maybe 4, standing motionless on the dunes. They didn't move, but I could feel their presence, heavy and menacing, like a weight pressing down on my chest. We didn't stop until we reached the entrance to another path through the dunes. Scrambling up the slope, we paused at the top to look back. The figures were still there, standing like sentinels in the darkness. Their heads were tilted slightly, as if watching us. We ran all the way back to Caleb's house, too scared to retrieve our bikes. That night, we stayed awake, the events replaying in our minds over and over. The next morning, we returned to the beach in the safety of daylight. Our bikes were gone, and there was no sign of the figures. The buzzing sound was gone too, leaving behind only an eerie silence. We never went back to that beach. Even now, years later, the memory still haunts me. I've tried to explain it away, a trick of the light, our minds playing tricks on us, but deep down, I know we saw something that night, something we weren't meant to see. Beaches unsettle me now. It wasn't always that way, though far from it. Some of my happiest memories as a kid were tied to summers spent by the shore. My family had a modest beach house where weekends were filled with laughter, salty air, and carefree days. When I wasn't at my family's place, I'd often find myself at my friend Ryan's house by the water. Those summers seemed perfect, an endless string of golden days and cool nights. But everything changed one particular summer. I was 17, and Ryan had invited me and our mutual friend Ethan to spend a weekend at his family's beach house near Maple Bay. This time, it was different. Ryan's parents were out of town, leaving us to enjoy the place without supervision. It was a dream come true freedom, a beautiful house, and the ocean. As the sun set, we settled into the house, unpacked our stuff, and began messaging some friends to see who was around. After some back and forth, we got a reply from 3 girls we knew: Amber, Lily, and Sarah. They were staying nearby and were more than happy to come hang out. The night started out perfect. The 6 of us spent hours laughing, drinking from the bottles we'd swiped from our parents, and listening to music. Around midnight, we decided to take the party outside to the small heated pool in Ryan's backyard. The water was warm, the music was low, and the night air was just cool enough to make the experience unforgettable. We were all sitting in the pool, passing around a joint, when Ryan suddenly turned the music all the way down. "Hey," he said quietly, staring past me. "Do you see that?" "See what?" I asked, turning around. He pointed toward the lagoon. Across the water, the faint outlines of houses were just barely visible in the darkness. "There's someone standing on the dock over there," Ryan said, his voice tight. I squinted but couldn't make anything out. "You're imagining things, man," I said, trying to laugh it off. Ryan shook his head. "No, I know the family that lives there. They're in Florida this week." The girls weren't taking any chances. "Let's go inside," Amber said, her voice a little shaky. We all climbed out of the pool and started drying off in the yard. That's when Ethan froze. "What the?" he muttered, staring at the lagoon. We all turned to look. There, on the dock across the water, were 4 tall, dark silhouettes. They stood perfectly still, facing us. A car passed by on the road behind us, its headlights briefly lighting up the scene. The sight was unmistakable: 4 figures, motionless and eerie, staring in our direction. Inside. "Now," Ryan whispered, his voice trembling. We didn't hesitate. We ran for the sliding door, and Ryan locked it behind us while Ethan bolted to the front door. We huddled together in the living room, barely breathing, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Then we heard it. 4 distinct splashes, one after the other. "They're swimming," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. Panic erupted. Ryan cursed, realizing he'd forgotten to lock the upstairs sliding door that led to the deck. Before we could even process what to do, we heard its soft, deliberate footsteps coming from above. That was it. We bolted for the front door. Ethan fumbled with the car keys but managed to get the engine started just as we piled in. He tore out of the driveway so fast he clipped Ryan's mailbox. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away. Once we felt safe, we called the police. They searched the house and gave us the all-clear to return, but the damage was done. The top floor was ransacked. Electronics, jewelry, and other valuables were gone. Worse still, Ryan's family boat was missing. It had been tied to the dock, but the thieves had used it to escape. The police believed they'd found the spare key hidden under the steering wheel, a spot only someone familiar with the family would have known about. Whoever those people were, they knew we'd be there. They knew the house, the boat, and its secrets. The police never caught them, and to this day, we don't know who they were or why they picked that night to strike. That experience changed me. Now, every night, I check and double-check every door and window in my house. I don't care how safe the neighborhood feels. I refuse to take chances. You shouldn't either.